June 9, 1945. The volcanic ridges north of Naha, Okinawa. Sergeant First Class Robert Chen gripped the carrying handles of the 75mm recoilless rifle as his two-man crew struggled to position the 114-pound weapon on its tripod. Behind them, 3 rifle companies had been pinned down for 6 hours by a Japanese pillbox network that naval bombardment couldn't touch and flamethrowers couldn't reach. The concrete fortifications were buried too deep into the coral limestone, their firing ports positioned with mathematical precision to create interlocking fields of fire that had already cost the 96th Infantry Division 43 casualties that morning alone. Standard doctrine said artillery this powerful required horses or trucks, recoil mechanisms weighing hundreds of pounds, and firing positions hundreds of yards behind the infantry. But the M20 defied every rule the Army had written about how big guns were supposed to work. It had no recoil system, no trail, no way it should function according to conventional physics. When the weapon arrived on Okinawa 3 months earlier, experienced artillerymen had laughed at its absurd design. Infantry officers questioned whether it would explode in their faces. Even the Japanese couldn't believe what they were seeing when this impossible gun started appearing everywhere on the battlefield, destroying fortifications that had taken months to build. The question wasn't whether the 75mm recoilless rifle could work. According to 600 years of artillery science, it couldn't. The question was how something that violated every principle of conventional warfare was about to rewrite the rules of infantry combat, one shattered pillbox at a time. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The concept of a recoilless rifle emerged from a problem as old as gunpowder itself. Every artillery piece ever built faced the same fundamental challenge, dictated by Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there exists an equal and opposite reaction. When a gun fires a projectile forward, the weapon itself recoils backward with tremendous force. This simple physics had shaped 6 centuries of artillery design, creating increasingly complex mechanisms to absorb, redirect, or dampen the violent kick that threatened to destroy both weapon and crew. But by 1944, as American forces island hopped across the Pacific toward Japan, this ancient problem had become a critical tactical weakness. The Japanese had abandoned their earlier strategy of defending beaches and had instead transformed every captured island into a fortress. On Palayu, Iwo Jima, and now Okinawa, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's defensive philosophy had created underground networks of reinforced concrete bunkers, pillboxes, and cave systems that proved nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. Naval bombardment pounded these positions for days, expending thousands of shells that merely scarred the surface, while Japanese defenders waited safely in tunnels carved 30 feet below ground. The tactical mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. American infantry advancing against these positions needed artillery support that could move with them, engage targets at close range, and deliver enough explosive power to penetrate concrete walls 2 to 3 feet thick. Traditional field artillery, even the relatively light 75mm pack howitzer, required multiple crew members, weighed 300 to 400 pounds, disassembled, and couldn't be positioned close enough to provide direct fire support without exposing gun crews to devastating counterfire. The M1 Garand rifle and Browning automatic rifle that had served infantry so well in Europe were useless against concrete and steel. Even the 2.36-inch bazooka, which had revolutionized anti-tank warfare, lacked the penetrating power necessary to defeat heavily fortified positions. The Ordnance Department Small Arms Division had begun exploring recoilless weapons in 1943, driven by reports from the European theater about German paratroopers using a 75mm smoothbore recoilless gun during the invasion of Crete. The concept seemed almost magical in its simplicity. Instead of containing all the propellant gases within a sealed breech, forcing them to push the projectile forward while simultaneously driving the weapon backward, a recoilless system vented gases through the rear of the weapon. The escaping gases created forward thrust that counteracted the rearward push of the projectile, theoretically eliminating recoil entirely. But theory and battlefield reality existed in different worlds, separated by the brutal testing ground of combat where weapons either worked or killed the men who carried them. The engineering challenges were enormous. Artillery shells needed to contain propellant in perforated casings that could withstand handling and transportation while allowing gases to escape at precisely the right moment. The breach required venting mechanisms that could direct explosive gases safely away from the crew while maintaining enough pressure to propel the projectile at useful velocities. Most critically, the weapon needed to be light enough for infantry to carry while delivering shells powerful enough to accomplish what tons of naval gunfire could not. By November 1943, the first test firing of a prototype took place at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The weapon performed exactly as the physics predicted, launching its projectile downrange while remaining nearly motionless on its mount. But performance on a test range bore little resemblance to combat effectiveness. Artillery officers who witnessed the demonstrations remained deeply skeptical. Weapon weighed 114 pounds, far heavier than any shoulder-fired weapon, but absurdly light for anything firing 75mm shells. Its 82-inch length made it awkward to transport through jungle or across coral ridges. Most troubling was the massive backblast that erupted from the rear venturi each time the weapon fired, creating a cone of superheated gases and debris that extended 60 feet behind the gun position. Combat infantrymen who reviewed the weapon's specifications raised immediate practical objections. The backblast would reveal their position to every Japanese observer within sight, making shoot-and-scoot tactics nearly impossible. The weight, while impressive for an artillery piece, remained prohibitive for men already carrying rifles, ammunition, grenades, and the dozens of pounds of equipment necessary for sustained combat. The weapon required a tripod, adding another 35 pounds to be carried. Each 75mm shell weighed between 20 and 23 pounds, meaning a practical combat load of even 6 rounds represented over 130 pounds of ammunition that would need to be man-packed across terrain where jeeps and trucks couldn't operate. Artillery specialists pointed out that the perforated shell casings were a maintenance nightmare. The hundreds of small holes drilled into each casing had to remain clear of debris, moisture, and the ever-present coral dust that infiltrated everything on Pacific Islands. A single blocked perforation could cause catastrophic pressure buildup, potentially destroying the weapon and killing its crew. The plastic liner inside each casing, designed to keep moisture out until the moment of firing, added complexity and potential failure points. Traditional artillery ammunition was robust and simple. These recoilless rounds were delicate, finicky, and unproven under the brutal conditions of amphibious warfare. Production of the M20 began in March 1945 at factories that were already stretched beyond capacity producing conventional weapons. The first shipments arrived in the European theater just as Germany collapsed, meaning the weapon saw minimal action against Wehrmacht positions. But the Pacific War continued with no end in sight. Intelligence estimates predicted that invading the Japanese home islands would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties, with fighting potentially continuing into 1946 or beyond. Every weapon that might reduce those casualties deserved consideration, even ones that violated artillery doctrine and seemed likely to fail under combat conditions. The M20 recoilless rifle that arrived on Okinawa in April 1945 looked nothing like conventional artillery. The barrel was smooth and unadorned, lacking the recoil mechanisms that added bulk and weight to traditional guns. The rear of the weapon flared outward into a large conical venturi covered by a perforated blast shield, giving it an appearance that suggested improvised construction rather than precision engineering. Carrying handles jutted from either side of the barrel just forward of the balance point, though carrying a 114-pound tube across broken terrain proved exhausting, even for men in peak physical condition. The weapon mounted on an M1917A1 machine gun tripod, the same mounting used for water-cooled Browning heavy machine guns. This decision reflected practical logistics rather than optimal design. The Army already had thousands of these tripods in inventory, and using existing equipment simplified supply chains that were already stressed supporting operations across thousands of miles of ocean. But the tripod's low mounting height meant gun crews had to operate from prone or kneeling positions, exposing them to enemy fire while making ammunition handling awkward and physically demanding. 2 optical sights came with each weapon. A telescopic direct-fire sight allowed for precision engagement of visible targets at ranges up to 1,000 yards. A separate indirect fire sight permitted the weapon to function as impromptu artillery, lobbing high explosive shells in high arcs to reach targets behind cover or in defilade. This versatility was unprecedented for a man-portable weapon, but it also meant crews needed training in 2 completely different firing techniques. Direct fire required the gunner to expose himself to enemy observation while aiming. Indirect fire demanded mathematical calculations to determine range, elevation, and deflection, skills that took weeks or months to develop. The ammunition selection reflected the weapon's dual role as both anti-tank gun and infantry support weapon. High-explosive, anti-tank shells, known as heat rounds, used shaped charge warheads capable of penetrating 4 inches of armor plate. The 20.5-pound projectiles could theoretically defeat any Japanese tank, though armor encounters in the Pacific remained rare. The real value lay in their ability to punch through concrete fortifications, creating fist-sized holes that allowed blast and fragmentation to reach defenders inside. High explosive rounds, weighing 21.8 pounds, delivered pure destructive power against personnel, light fortifications, and area targets. White phosphorus smoke rounds served dual purposes, generating obscuring clouds for troop movements while also functioning as anti-personnel weapons, as burning phosphorus particles inflicted horrific wounds that were nearly impossible to extinguish. Standard doctrine called for 3-man crews, though the weapon could theoretically be operated by 2 soldiers in emergencies. The gunner aimed and fired, the loader handled ammunition and operated the breech, and the 3rd man served as ammunition bearer and observer. Combat loads typically consisted of 6 to 8 rounds, representing the maximum weight crews could carry along with their personal weapons and equipment. Additional ammunition had to be stockpiled at firing positions or hand-carried forward by other infantrymen, creating supply challenges that had no easy solutions. Training on the M20 proved problematic because so few weapons existed, and combat demands left little time for familiarization. Rifle companies receiving recoilless rifles in April and May 1945 often got brief demonstrations rather than comprehensive instruction. Gun crews learned by doing, discovering the weapon's capabilities and limitations through trial and error, under conditions where mistakes cost lives. The massive backblast surprised even soldiers who had been warned about it, as the actual experience of having a cone of flame and gas erupt 6 feet behind your position proved more intense than any verbal description could convey. The first significant combat use of 75mm recoilless rifles occurred during the battle for Okinawa's southern defensive lines in late April 1945. The 96th Infantry Division, fighting through the Kakazu Ridge complex, found themselves facing a defensive system that embodied everything Japanese engineers had learned from 3 years of defeat. Pillboxes, constructed from reinforced concrete, had walls 30 inches thick, proof against anything short of direct hits from battleship shells. Cave positions extended hundreds of feet into the coral limestone, connecting defensive positions through tunnels that allowed Japanese soldiers to disappear from one location and emerge at another. Every approach was pre-registered for mortar and artillery fire, turning attempts at flanking maneuvers into killing grounds. Lieutenant Colonel Byron Mitchell, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 383rd Infantry Regiment, requested recoilless rifles after his companies suffered 80 casualties in 2 days trying to reduce a single fortified ridge. The weapons arrived with minimal documentation and no experienced instructors, leaving Mitchell's soldiers to decipher their operation through experimentation. Sergeant William Adamson, a veteran artilleryman who had served in North Africa and Italy, spent an afternoon studying the weapon's mechanism before declaring it either brilliant or suicidal. He wasn't sure which. The first combat firing took place on April 27th from a position 200 yards behind the forward infantry line. Adamson's crew targeted a pillbox that had been pounded by naval gunfire for 3 days without visible effect. The concrete structure sat at the base of a coral outcropping, its firing port oriented to sweep the approach route American infantry needed to advance. Previous attempts to destroy it with satchel charges had cost 6 casualties, as Japanese machine gunners cut down anyone who tried to close within throwing distance. Adamson loaded a heat round, verified his crew was clear of the backblast area, and settled behind the telescopic sight. The range was 350 yards, well within the weapon's effective envelope. Through the optic, he could see the dark rectangle of the firing port, a target perhaps 18 inches wide and 8 inches tall. The shot needed to be precise. A near miss would accomplish nothing except reveal their position. The trigger pull was smooth and progressive, unlike the yanking motion required for many weapons. The firing pin struck the primer, igniting propellant that began burning inside the perforated casing. Gas rushed forward, pushing the projectile down the rifled barrel while simultaneously venting through hundreds of small holes into the breech chamber. From there, the gas escaped through the rear venturi in a roaring blast that sent dirt, leaves, and debris flying in a 60-foot cone behind the weapon. The effect on target was devastating. The heat round struck the pillbox slightly left of the firing port, its shape-charged warhead penetrating the concrete in a focused jet of superheated metal that reached temperatures exceeding 5,000 degrees. Secondary explosions inside the position suggested the penetrator had reached stored ammunition. When the smoke cleared, the firing port showed a jagged hole where precise Japanese engineering had been, and the steady hammering of the machine gun had stopped permanently. Adamson's crew fired 8 more rounds that afternoon, engaging targets that had resisted conventional weapons for days. Each shot produced the same spectacular backblast, the same precision impact, and the same stunned reactions from infantrymen who had watched artillery shells bounce off these fortifications. Without effect, by evening, word was spreading through the division that someone had finally found a weapon that worked against Japanese concrete. But success brought its own problems. The massive backblast made repositioning essential after every shot, as Japanese observers quickly learned to target the distinctive flame signature. The weapon's weight made rapid displacement difficult, particularly across terrain chewed into mud by weeks of bombardment. Ammunition resupply became a constant challenge, as each shell represented a significant physical burden for soldiers already carrying everything needed to survive in combat. Most critically, only a handful of recoilless rifles had reached Okinawa, meaning most infantry units continued fighting with weapons inadequate for the mission. Japanese defenders, initially confused by the new weapon, quickly developed countermeasures. Observers began calling mortar fire on recoilless rifle positions immediately after they revealed themselves through firing. Machine gun teams specifically targeted crews, setting up the distinctive tubes, knowing that eliminating the weapons would restore their defensive advantages. Snipers who had learned to identify American officers by their map cases and binoculars now added recoilless rifle crews to their priority target lists. The tactical revolution the M20 represented became clear during the fight for Hill 178-8 in early May. The limestone ridge dominated a critical road junction, and Japanese engineers had transformed it into a fortress with 23 separate defensive positions connected by tunnels. Previous assaults had failed with horrific casualties, as every approach channeled attackers into predetermined killing zones. Artillery preparation merely rearranged the surface rubble without touching positions carved into solid rock. Captain James Thornton, commanding Company E, received 2 recoilless rifles and 8 rounds of ammunition, with instructions to make them count. His attack plan abandoned conventional tactics entirely. Instead of preliminary bombardment followed by infantry assault, Thornton positioned his recoilless rifles within 200 yards of Japanese positions and used them for direct precision fire against specific targets. Each pillbox, each cave mouth, each firing position received individual attention from heat rounds that could reach where conventional weapons couldn't. The attack succeeded in 40 minutes, a time frame that would have been impossible using traditional methods. Japanese positions that had withstood days of naval gunfire were silenced by single, well-placed shots from weapons that weighed a tenth as much as conventional artillery. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. American infantry, who had grown accustomed to frontal assaults against prepared positions costing dozens of casualties, suddenly possessed a weapon that could suppress or destroy fortifications before the attack even began. Japanese defenders, whose entire defensive philosophy depended on fortifications, proof against American firepower, found themselves vulnerable to a weapon that appeared anywhere on the battlefield without warning. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The success of recoilless rifles on Okinawa forced a fundamental reassessment of infantry weapons doctrine. Traditional artillery operated from positions hundreds or thousands of yards behind the front lines, delivering indirect fire based on radio requests from forward observers. The time lag between requesting fire and shells arriving on target often measured in minutes, during which tactical situations changed and opportunities disappeared. Recoilless rifles collapsed this timeline to seconds, putting artillery-level firepower directly in the hands of infantry commanders who could see targets and engage them immediately. This integration of heavy firepower with infantry maneuver represented a conceptual breakthrough as significant as any technological advancement. For the first time, rifle company commanders possessed organic weapons capable of defeating fortifications without requesting support from battalion or division assets. The psychological effect on junior leaders was transformative. Lieutenants and captains who had grown accustomed to being denied fire support requests due to ammunition shortages or competing priorities now controlled weapons that could crack any defensive position within line of sight. But the weapon's success created demand that production couldn't meet. By June 1945, every rifle company on Okinawa was requesting recoilless rifles, but only limited numbers existed. Distribution decisions became contentious, with units scheduled for the most difficult missions receiving priority while others made do with bazookas and satchel charges. This scarcity elevated the weapons to almost mythical status among frontline troops, who shared exaggerated stories about their effectiveness and lobbied their commanders for access. The maintenance challenges that skeptics had predicted materialized as weapons spent weeks in combat conditions. Coral dust infiltrated the perforated shell casings, requiring careful cleaning before each use. The blast shield covering the rear venturi sustained damage from repeated firing, with perforations enlarging or metal warping from thermal stress. Optical sights proved fragile, their precision adjustments vulnerable to the shocks and vibrations of combat. Crews learned to baby their weapons, treating them with care usually reserved for far more delicate equipment. Ammunition supply presented constant headaches for logistics officers. Each shell weighed more than 20 pounds and required careful handling due to the perforated casings and sensitive fuses. Standard ammunition trucks couldn't access forward positions, meaning rounds had to be man-packed across terrain where every yard represented exhausting physical labor. Units rationed ammunition carefully, weighing whether specific targets justified expending irreplaceable shells. This conservation mindset sometimes conflicted with tactical necessity, as company commanders hoarded rounds for critical moments, while infantry struggled against positions that recoilless rifles could have eliminated easily. The Japanese response to recoilless rifles demonstrated their tactical flexibility and learning capacity. After initial shock gave way to analysis, Japanese commanders issued specific instructions for countering the new weapon. Defensive positions were redesigned with smaller firing ports that presented more difficult targets. Cave systems incorporated turns and bends that limited the effectiveness of shells penetrating the entrance. Most effectively, Japanese artillery observers learned to recognize the distinctive backblast signature and immediately called fire on those positions, knowing American crews would be vulnerable during the reload process. These countermeasures forced American crews to develop their own tactical innovations. Gun positions were prepared with overhead cover that concealed the backblast flash from aerial observation. Dummy positions with smoke pots created false signatures to draw Japanese fire away from real weapons. Crews practiced rapid displacement drills, breaking down and repositioning weapons in under 2 minutes to avoid counterfire. The evolution of tactics and counter-tactics accelerated as both sides learned from every engagement. The human cost of operating recoilless rifles became evident as casualty reports accumulated. Gun crews suffered disproportionate losses compared to standard infantry as Japanese forces prioritized eliminating these weapons. The backblast, while theoretically directed away from the crew, still generated enough concussion to cause hearing damage after repeated firings. Soldiers who served on recoilless rifle crews for extended periods experienced permanent hearing loss. Their eardrums damaged by repeated exposure to blast overpressure that safety regulations would later deem unacceptable. Despite these costs, demand for the weapons never decreased. Infantry commanders who had experienced combat with recoilless rifles refused to attack without them, understanding that their presence meant fewer casualties among riflemen who would otherwise assault fortified positions directly. The calculus was brutal, but clear. Better to lose recoilless rifle crews than entire platoons in frontal assaults. This utilitarian logic troubled some officers, but combat reality left little room for moral ambiguity about which weapons and tactics saved lives overall. By late May, as fighting ground through Okinawa's southern defenses toward Shuri Castle, recoilless rifles had become integral to American tactical planning. Every major attack incorporated them, with guns positioned to provide direct fire support during assaults. After action reports consistently credited the weapons with enabling advances that would otherwise have been impossible or prohibitively expensive in casualties. Yet, even advocates acknowledged the limitations. The weapons weren't magic, couldn't operate in all conditions, and required skilled crews who became increasingly scarce as casualties mounted. The broader implications extended beyond Okinawa to planning for the invasion of Japan itself. Operation Olympic, scheduled for November 1945, envisioned landing 400,000 American troops on Kyushu against an estimated 300,000 Japanese defenders. Intelligence indicated that Japanese fortifications on the home islands dwarfed anything encountered on Okinawa, with concrete walls sometimes exceeding 6 feet in thickness and defensive systems extending miles underground. Planners studying these intelligence reports concluded that recoilless rifles would be essential for the invasion, with production ramped up to provide each rifle company multiple weapons. The morning of June 9, 1945, began with the kind of pre-dawn stillness that experienced soldiers had learned to distrust. Sergeant First Class Robert Chen had been on Okinawa for 53 days, long enough to understand that quiet mornings often preceded the worst fighting. His recoilless rifle crew, reduced from 3 men to 2 after Private Morrison took shrapnel during the Sugarloaf fighting, had repositioned twice during the night to avoid Japanese infiltrators who seemed to possess an uncanny ability to locate American weapon positions in darkness. Chen's crew belonged to Company K, 383rd Infantry Regiment, 96th Infantry Division. Their unit had been assigned a section of ridgeline north of Naha that intelligence described as moderately defended. This assessment proved optimistic within the first hour of daylight, when Japanese positions that aerial reconnaissance had missed revealed themselves through devastating machine gun and mortar fire. The ridge itself rose perhaps 80 feet above the surrounding terrain, its slopes composed of coral limestone that had been carved and tunneled until the entire formation resembled a honeycomb of interconnected defensive positions. Private Eugene Whitmore, Chen's surviving crew member, had been a replacement who arrived in April with minimal training and no combat experience. Now, After weeks of fighting that had transformed the nervous teenager into a hollow-eyed veteran, he handled ammunition and operated the breech with mechanical efficiency. The partnership between them had evolved beyond words, communication, reduced to gestures and glances that conveyed everything necessary about targets, ranges, and timing. Their M20 recoilless rifle occupied a hasty firing positions, scraped into the coral, 50 yards behind Company K's forward line. The location provided adequate fields of fire toward the ridge while offering some protection from direct observation. A camouflage net, more symbolic than effective given the weapon's backblast, draped over the position. 6 heat rounds and 2 high-explosive shells represented their entire ammunition supply, carefully husbanded against targets that justified their expenditure. The first target revealed itself at 06:15 when a Japanese machine gun opened fire from a cave mouth approximately 400 yards distant. The position had remained silent during the previous day's fighting, its crew waiting patiently for American forces to advance into optimal firing range. Now, tracers reached out across the broken ground, seeking infantry who had moved forward under cover of darkness. 2 Marines from the adjacent sector went down in the first burst, their bodies crumpling in the distinctive way that indicated fatal hits rather than wounds. Chen studied the target through his telescopic sight, noting the cave's position at the base of a limestone outcropping that provided overhead protection against indirect fire. The opening appeared perhaps 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall, large enough for a machine gun and crew, but small enough to present a difficult target at this range. Naval gunfire had pocked the surrounding rock with crater scars, evidence that previous attempts to neutralize this position had failed. The cave likely extended deep into the ridge, with multiple chambers and turns that would defeat anything except a direct hit through the entrance. Whitmore already had a heat round ready, the 20.5-pound shell cradled in his arms as he waited for Chen's signal. The loading procedure had become routine through repetition, though it never became casual given the consequences of mistakes. The shell slid into the breech with a metallic click that confirmed proper seating. Whitmore verified that the perforated casing aligned correctly with the Venturi system, then stepped clear of the back blast zone, moving to Chen's right where he could observe the impact and call corrections if necessary. The shot felt perfect from the moment Chen's finger took up slack on the trigger. The heat round departed the barrel in a roar of propellant gas that sent a cone of flame and debris erupting behind the weapon. Through the sight, Chen watched the projectile's flight, a dark streak that seemed to take forever, despite covering 400 yards in less than a second. The impact came slightly high and right of the cave mouth, close enough that the shaped charge jet penetrated the limestone and sent fragments ricocheting into the cave interior. The machine gun fell silent, but Chen knew better than to assume the position was destroyed. Japanese crews had demonstrated remarkable ability to absorb punishment and continue fighting, their determination and tactical discipline making them the most formidable enemy American forces had yet encountered. He waited, watching through the telescopic sight for movement or renewed fire. 30 seconds passed, then a minute. The cave mouth remained dark and silent. Company K's advance resumed, riflemen moving by squads across terrain that moments before had been swept by machine gun fire. They covered perhaps 50 yards before another position opened fire, this one a concrete pillbox, built into the ridge line, with interlocking fields that caught the advancing infantry from an unexpected angle. 3 soldiers went down immediately, while others scrambled for cover that barely existed in the broken coral. The pillbox represented a more challenging target than the cave. Its concrete construction was visible even from Chen's position, suggesting walls at least 2 feet thick. The firing port was narrow, perhaps 12 inches wide, oriented to provide maximum coverage of the approach routes while minimizing exposure. Destroying this position would require either multiple heat rounds or an impossibly lucky shot that penetrated directly through the firing port. Chen made a decision that departed from standard doctrine, but reflected lessons learned through combat experience. Instead of trying for a direct hit through the firing port, he aimed at the concrete wall adjacent to it, targeting the junction where wall met foundation. Concrete fortifications, however well constructed, possessed inherent weak points where different construction phases met or where rebar reinforcement terminated, A shaped charge jet striking these junctions might crack the entire structure, creating failures that propagated beyond the immediate impact point. The second heat round struck exactly where Chen aimed, the explosion sending a spider web of cracks radiating across the pillbox wall. The firing port went dark as the machine gun ceased operating. Though whether from crew casualties or structural damage remained unclear, what mattered was that Company K could advance. And they did, crossing ground that minutes earlier had been a killing zone. The pattern repeated throughout the morning. Japanese positions revealed themselves through fire. Chen's crew engaged them with precision shots. Infantry advanced through gaps created by the recoilless rifle's devastating effectiveness. By 0930, they had expended 4 heat rounds and advanced Company K nearly 200 yards up the ridge. But Chen knew their effectiveness was creating its own problems. Somewhere on that ridge, Japanese observers were tracking their position, calculating firing solutions, and preparing counterfire that would arrive without warning. The mortar rounds came at 0945, 381mm shells that impacted within 20 yards of Chen's position. Coral fragments filled the air like shrapnel, slashing through the camouflage net and forcing both soldiers flat against the shallow floor of their fighting position. The Japanese had excellent artillery discipline, firing short preparatory bursts to confirm range before committing to sustained bombardment. Chen recognized this pattern from previous engagements and knew they had perhaps 2 minutes before the real barrage began. Relocating a recoilless rifle under fire was never easy, and with only 2 men, it bordered on suicidal. The weapon itself weighed over 100 pounds, the tripod another 35, and their remaining ammunition added another 90 pounds to be moved. Standard doctrine called for at least 3 men to displace the weapon efficiently, but standard doctrine had written by people who had never tried to carry a 100-pound tube across broken coral while Japanese mortars searched for them. They managed it through desperate improvisation and the kind of strength that comes from absolute necessity. Chen took the barrel and optical sights, while Whitmore grabbed the tripod and ammunition bag. Their new position, selected during a brief reconnaissance the previous evening, lay 30 yards to the left in a shallow depression that provided marginally better overhead cover. The distance seemed infinite as they stumbled across terrain, churned by weeks of bombardment, each expecting the next mortar salvo to catch them in the open. They reached cover just as the sustained barrage began, 6 rounds impacting on their previous position with precision that confirmed Japanese observers had marked it perfectly. Coral chunks the size of baseballs flew through the air, clattering against rocks and creating their own secondary hazards. The barrage continued for 3 minutes, methodically saturating an area where Chen and Whitmore would have died if they had remained in place. From their new position, partially concealed by an overhanging coral shelf, Chen studied the ridge through binoculars rather than the telescopic sight. The Japanese defensive system was revealing itself through the morning's fighting, layers of mutually supporting positions that had been carefully sighted to provide overlapping fields of fire. Eliminating individual positions created temporary gaps, but the overall defensive network remained intact. Company K's advance had stalled again, pinned by fire from positions Chen couldn't engage, without exposing his weapon to observation and immediate counterfire. The tactical problem required a solution that balanced aggression with survival. Chen could continue engaging targets as they revealed themselves, accepting that each shot risked drawing counterfire that might destroy his weapon and crew. Or he could remain silent, preserving his capability while Company K's infantry struggled against fortifications they couldn't defeat with rifles and grenades. The decision was made easier by the radio call that came at 10:15 from Lieutenant Morrison, Company K's commander, requesting immediate fire on a pillbox that had already cost them 6 casualties. The target sat at the ridge crest, perhaps 600 yards distant, right at the edge of the M20's effective range for precision work. The pillbox's construction appeared more substantial than others Chen had engaged, with concrete walls that might exceed 3 feet in thickness. Its firing port commanded the entire approach to the ridge crest, making it impossible for infantry to advance without neutralizing this position first. Naval gunfire couldn't reach it due to the angle, and mortars lacked the penetrating power necessary to defeat that much concrete. Chen had 2 heat rounds remaining. Missing with the first would likely reveal his position without accomplishing the mission, inviting counterfire that would prevent a second attempt. The range was long enough that wind, elevation change, and the natural dispersion of the weapon all became significant factors. He had made similar shots before, but never under conditions where failure meant watching infantry die while they waited for support that couldn't reach them. Whitmore loaded the heat round without comment, his movements reflecting the same practiced efficiency that characterized all his actions now. The perforated casing showed slight damage from their hasty displacement, small dents that hadn't existed before but didn't appear serious enough to affect function. He double-checked the alignment, verified the electrical contact that would initiate the shape charge sequence, then moved clear of the back blast zone and waited. Through the telescopic sight, the pillbox appeared as a grey rectangle against darker rock, its firing port a thin, black line that seemed impossibly small at this distance. Chen could see the distinctive muzzle flash of a Japanese machine gun firing from within, steady and methodical as it swept across Company K's positions. Each burst likely represented casualties, soldiers who had volunteered or been drafted, trained for months, survived the voyage across the Pacific, and now died on a coral ridge that would appear on maps as a nameless elevation if it appeared at all. The trigger pull was smooth, the weapon's mechanism functioning exactly as designed. The heat round departed in a blast that sent dust and loose coral fragments cascading from the ceiling of their fighting position. 600 yards distant, the projectiles struck the pillbox 2 feet bereft of the firing port, the shaped charge jet penetrating concrete in a focused stream of superheated metal traveling at speeds that made conventional armor meaningless. The secondary explosion that followed suggested the shaped charge had reached something volatile inside the pillbox, perhaps stored ammunition or a fuel cache for a flamethrower. Smoke boiled from the firing port and from cracks that appeared in the concrete structure, evidence of catastrophic internal damage. The machine gun fell silent and remained that way, the position neutralized as effectively as if it had been hit by a battleship shell. Company K's advance resumed immediately, infantry rising from cover and moving forward with the cautious aggression that characterized experienced soldiers who knew better than to assume any position was truly destroyed until confirmed by direct observation. They reached the pillbox 20 minutes later and found 4 Japanese soldiers dead inside, killed by the combination of shaped charge jet, blast overpressure, and secondary explosions that had turned the fortified position into a concrete tomb. But Chen's success had attracted attention that couldn't be ignored or evaded. Japanese observers had tracked the distinctive back blast signature, and now counterfire was coming in the form of heavy mortar rounds that demonstrated the enemy-possessed weapons equivalent to American 120mm mortars. The impacts began walking toward Chen's position with methodical precision, each salvo landing closer than the last, as Japanese spotters adjusted based on where previous rounds struck. The coral depression that had seemed like adequate cover now felt like a trap. Moving meant exposing themselves to observation during daylight, virtually guaranteeing accurate fire during their displacement. Staying meant waiting while mortars bracketed their position, eventually landing the direct hit that would end their war in a microsecond of high explosive violence. Neither option seemed survivable, yet remaining inactive wasn't an option either, as Company K continued pushing up the ridge against positions that only the recoilless rifle could defeat effectively. Chen made the decision that had defined American success throughout the Pacific War when conventional tactics failed. He would continue fighting, engaging targets as they appeared, accepting whatever counterfire resulted, trusting that accomplishing the mission mattered more than individual survival. This calculus wasn't heroic or admirable in any conventional sense, simply the brutal mathematics of combat where some deaths prevented others and the only unacceptable outcome was failure to accomplish the objective. The last heat round in Chen's ammunition bag represented their final capability to engage hardened fortifications. After this, they possessed only 2 high-explosive rounds, suitable for area targets, but useless against concrete and steel. The weapon would become dead weight, 100+ pounds of metal that served no purpose except as a reminder of what they could no longer accomplish. The target that justified expending their final heat round, appeared at 11:20 when a Japanese anti-tank gun opened fire from a camouflaged position halfway up the ridge. The weapon, likely a 37mm Type 11 infantry gun, was devastating against the light vehicles and troop concentrations that characterized American logistics. Its first shot destroyed a jeep carrying wounded back to the aid station, killing the driver and 2 passengers instantly. The second shot scattered an ammunition-carrying party, sending soldiers diving for cover while precious shells spilled across the coral. Anti-tank guns represented priority targets because their high-velocity rounds could penetrate anything except heavy armor, making them effective against virtually every American vehicle on Okinawa. The Japanese had learned to position these weapons in defilade, hiding them from direct observation until they fired, then moving them through tunnel systems before counter-battery fire could respond. Engaging this gun required not just hitting its position, but doing so quickly enough that the crew couldn't displace before the round arrived. Chen's final heat round was loaded, aimed and fired in less than 40 seconds, speed prioritized over precision, because precision meant nothing if the target moved before impact. The range was 350 yards, well within the weapon's capabilities, but the target was partially concealed behind coral outcroppings that provided natural fortification. The shot needed to be perfect, or it would accomplish nothing except waste their last effective round. The projectile struck the coral directly in front of the anti-tank gun position, the shaped charge jet penetrating the rock and sending fragments ricocheting through the confined space where the gun crew operated. The weapon itself remained visible. After the smoke cleared, its barrel still protruding from the camouflage, but no movement came from the position and no further shots were fired. Whether the crew was dead or simply suppressed didn't matter tactically. The gun was neutralized, and Company K could continue advancing without fearing high-velocity rounds arriving without warning. Chen and Whitmore sat in their fighting position, the M20 rendered partially obsolete by the expenditure of their last armor-piercing round. The 2 high-explosive shells they retained could engage area targets and personnel, but couldn't defeat the fortifications that still dotted the ridge above. Their war had shifted from offensive action to defensive survival, waiting for either ammunition resupply or orders to displace to a position where the weapon could be reloaded and returned to the fight. The resupply came at 14:30 in the form of Private Rodriguez, an ammunition bearer from company headquarters who had carried 4 heat rounds across 1,000 yards of contested terrain under sporadic Japanese fire. Each round weighed over 20 pounds, meaning Rodriguez had humped 80+ pounds of ammunition, while also carrying his rifle, equipment, and enough water to survive Okinawa's brutal heat. He arrived exhausted, dehydrated, and so relieved to reach cover that he nearly collapsed into their fighting position. But ammunition meant renewed capability, and renewed capability meant resuming the mission that had already cost Company K 37 casualties since dawn. Lieutenant Morrison's radio call came at 1500 with coordinates for 3 more positions that blocked the final advance to the ridge crest. Japanese defenders were falling back toward their final strongpoints, consolidating forces and ammunition for a last stand that would cost American lives for every yard of ground gained. Chen's crew engaged all 3 positions over the next hour, expending their fresh ammunition in a methodical destruction of fortifications that represented months of Japanese engineering effort. Each shot was followed by mortar fire that forced displacement to positions prepared during brief lulls in the fighting. The pattern was exhausting, terrifying, and brutally effective. By 1600, Company K had secured the ridge crest, consolidating their hold on terrain that had been considered impregnable just 12 hours earlier. The cost for Company K was 41 casualties, including 11 dead. For Chen's crew, it was complete exhaustion, partial hearing loss from repeated exposure to blast overpressure, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another ridge, another system of fortifications, another day of precision shooting under fire. For the M20 recoilless rifle that had made their success possible, It was validation of a design that had seemed ridiculous to artillery experts just months earlier. The broader tactical lessons from engagements like Chen's spread throughout American forces on Okinawa during June 1945. Every division and regiment reported similar experiences, praising the recoilless rifle's effectiveness while noting the casualties suffered by crews who operated them. After-action reports consistently emphasized three critical points. First, the weapons were devastatingly effective against fortifications when employed by trained crews. Second, the backblast made concealment nearly impossible, requiring constant displacement to avoid counterfire. Third, ammunition supply remained the limiting factor, as man-packing 20-pound shells across combat zones couldn't meet tactical demands. These lessons influenced planning for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Japan, scheduled for November 1945. Planners studying intelligence reports about Japanese home island defenses concluded that fortifications there would make Okinawa seem lightly defended by comparison. Concrete walls 6 feet thick, underground complexes extending hundreds of feet deep, defensive positions sited with years of preparation rather than months. The mathematics suggested that recoilless rifles would be even more critical during the invasion than they had been on Okinawa. Production schedules were adjusted to provide each rifle company with at least 2 M20 recoilless rifles by November. Ammunition production increased proportionally, with planners calculating that each weapon would fire 50 rounds during the first week of combat. Training programs were expanded to create larger pools of qualified crews, accepting that casualty rates among recoilless rifle operators would likely exceed 50% during sustained operations. The cold equations of amphibious assault planning left little room for optimism about survival rates when attacking prepared defenses. But history took a different turn when atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August, forcing Japanese surrender before Operation Downfall became necessary. The M20 recoilless rifles that had proven so effective on Okinawa never faced the ultimate test of assaulting Japan's home islands. The weapons were shipped back to the United States or transferred to occupation forces, their brief moment of combat glory ending with the war itself. The Korean War resurrected American interest in recoilless rifles when conflict erupted in June 1950. The M20 was rushed back into service alongside its smaller M18 57mm sibling, providing infantry with organic anti-tank capability against North Korean T-34 tanks. Initial optimism faded during the Battle of Osan on July 5th, when M20 crews discovered their heat rounds couldn't penetrate the T-34's frontal armor at combat ranges. The shaped charge warheads that had been devastating against Japanese pillboxes proved inadequate against modern Soviet tank armor. This failure led to rapid deployment of the M20 Super Bazooka, a 3.5-inch rocket launcher with improved penetration. The recoilless rifle's role shifted from anti-tank weapon to infantry support, the same mission it had performed so effectively on Okinawa. Korean War veterans remembered the M20 primarily for its effectiveness against Chinese fortifications in the mountains, where concrete bunkers and cave positions replicated the defensive systems American forces had encountered on Pacific Islands. The evolution continued through the 1950s with development of the 90mm M67 and 106mm M40 recoilless rifles. These weapons incorporated lessons learned from World War II and Korea, offering improved accuracy, better sights, and ammunition optimized for the infantry support role. They served through Vietnam, where they provided fire support in terrain that conventional artillery couldn't reach. But the fundamental limitations that skeptics had identified in 1944 never disappeared. The backblast remained a signature that revealed positions to enemy observation. The ammunition remained heavy and difficult to resupply in forward areas. The weapons themselves, while lighter than conventional artillery, still represented significant weight for infantry to transport. By the 1970s, wire-guided missiles began replacing recoilless rifles in most armies, offering precision engagement without the backblast signature that made recoilless weapons vulnerable. The M20 faded from American service by the early 1980s, replaced by weapon systems that had evolved from technologies that didn't exist when the recoilless rifle was developed. Modern infantry companies carry Javelin missiles and Carl Gustaf rocket launchers, weapons that fulfill similar roles with improved performance. But the fundamental concept that the M20 validated, putting artillery-level firepower in the hands of infantry commanders for immediate precision engagement, remains central to contemporary doctrine. The soldiers who operated M20 recoilless rifles on Okinawa are nearly all gone now, their memories of coral ridges and concrete pillboxes fading with them. Unit histories record their actions in sanitized language that speaks of objectives secured and positions neutralized, reducing human experience to tactical accomplishment. After-action reports note ammunition expended and casualties suffered, quantifying combat without capturing its reality. But scattered through archives and veteran accounts are glimpses of what it meant to aim a telescopic sight at a fortification 400 yards distant, knowing Japanese soldiers waited inside, pulling a trigger that sent a shaped charge round downrange while propellant gases erupted behind in a roar that announced your position to every enemy observer within sight. The mathematics of combat that turned men into casualties and casualties into statistics couldn't capture the moment when a pillbox that had killed your friends disappeared in a flash of high explosive, or when mortar rounds walked toward your position while you reloaded, or when ammunition ran out and the weapon became dead weight that mocked your helplessness. The irony of the M20's story lies in its timing. The weapon that had seemed ridiculous to artillery experts in 1944, that violated 600 years of cannon design principles that shouldn't have worked according to conventional physics, proved devastatingly effective during the few months it saw significant World War II combat. But those months came at the war's end, too late to influence most of the Pacific campaign, just early enough to validate concepts that would shape infantry weapons development for decades. If Okinawa had been invaded 6 months earlier, if production had begun a year sooner, if skeptics hadn't delayed development through cautious testing, the M20 might have been available for Peleliu or Iwo Jima. The counterfactual questions are unanswerable, but tantalizing. How many casualties might have been prevented if recoilless rifles had been available throughout the Pacific War rather than just its final campaign? The question assumes that weapons alone determine outcomes, ignoring the complex interplay of tactics, training, logistics, and leadership that actually determines success. But weapons matter, especially weapons that enable tactics previously impossible. The M20 recoilless rifle enabled infantry companies to engage fortified positions directly, immediately, precisely, without requesting support from assets that might not be available. That capability changed how American forces fought during Okinawa's final weeks, transforming infantry from forces that absorbed casualties, assaulting prepared positions, into forces that could reduce those positions before committing soldiers to the attack. That transformation justified the weapons development, validated the engineers who persisted despite skepticism, and honored the crews who operated them under fire. Sergeant Chen survived Okinawa and returned to California, his hearing permanently damaged, but his life intact. Private Whitmore made it home to Ohio, carrying memories he rarely discussed. Lieutenant Morrison commanded during Korea and retired as a colonel, his officer efficiency reports noting his tactical skill in employing supporting weapons. The M20 recoilless rifles they used were scrapped or sent to storage, museum pieces that represent an evolutionary dead end in weapons development. Modern soldiers studying military history might glance at them in passing, noting their crude construction and obsolete technology without understanding what they meant to men who used them when they were the only weapon that worked against fortifications that conventional arms couldn't touch. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen. Now, and don't forget to subscribe.